The morning sun in 73 BC cast long, indifferent shadows across Rome's bustling forum, illuminating not just the marble and the majesty, but the cold commercial heart of the empire, its largest slave market. Marcus Aemilia, his purse heavy with gold, moved through the crowd, not as a man seeking rare art or fine wine, but as a buyer of human flesh. His gaze, however, was not drawn to the strongest laborers or the most skilled artisans on the raised platforms. It was captured by a young woman, perhaps 19, standing utterly exposed on the auction block. Her name, Vercinga, a whisper of her life in a southern Gaulish village, had been erased. Now she was lot 47, a number chalked onto her shoulder beside a clinical list of her physical attributes and potential defects. An auctioneer's voice, smooth and practiced, cut through the din, extolling her sound teeth, no visible scars, hips suitable for bearing children, trained in household tasks. This was not a description of a person, but an inventory of a commodity. A wealthy senator stepped forward, his fingers forcing her jaws open to inspect her teeth for any sign of decay that might shorten her working life. Another buyer prodded her limbs, testing muscle tone and searching for hidden disease. A third lifted her hair, scrutinizing her scalp for lice or scars. She stood like a statue, her eyes fixed on a point far beyond the jeering crowd. This was not defiance. It was the hollow, broken stare of someone whose very soul had been systematically dismantled over months of captivity, brutal transport, and preparation for sale. Her captors had taught her that resistance meant immediate, excruciating punishment. So she had learned the only survival tactic left, to become an inanimate object while strangers violated her most intimate dignity. The true horror, however, is not in this single, gut-wrenching scene. The horror is that this was not an aberration. This was a Tuesday. This was business as usual in the greatest empire the world had ever known. Rome didn't merely tolerate slavery, it was the bedrock upon which the entire civilization was built, the engine that powered its economy, and a system it openly celebrated as proof of its own civilized superiority. What you are about to understand is that Roman slavery was not simply about forced labor under harsh conditions. It was a meticulously designed machine, an institution of unparalleled cruelty whose primary function was not just to extract work, but to annihilate human dignity itself. This was a system so thoroughly dehumanizing, so creatively cruel, and so completely normalized that our modern concepts of human rights would have seemed like a fantastical, alien invention to its architects. From the public auction blocks where men, women, and children were sold like cattle to the suffocating darkness of the mines where thousands perished unseen, to the private chambers of wealthy homes where masters wielded absolute unchecked power over body and soul, Roman slavery was a 5-century-long experiment in institutionalized horror. The evidence for this is not drawn from exaggerated Hollywood epics, but from the cold, hard records of the Romans themselves, the legal codes of Justinian, the histories of Suetonius, the moral critiques of Seneca, and the satires of Juvenal. These are not myths. They are documented facts recorded by historians, philosophers, and lawmakers who treated human beings as property with fewer legal protections than livestock. The most chilling aspect is that the Romans felt no shame. They wrote about their slave system with pride, considering it a hallmark of their advanced civilization and definitive proof of their superiority over the barbarian peoples they conquered and enslaved. The transformation of a free human being into a Roman slave was a process that began long before they ever saw the auction block. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul stands as a grim testament to this, where military campaigns were explicitly designed not to kill, but to capture. Historical accounts state that Caesar enslaved over 1 million Gauls, turning an entire nation into human merchandise for the insatiable Roman markets. The logistics of this human trafficking were industrial in scale. Slave traders, functioning like camp followers, trailed behind the legions with chains, restraints, and portable processing stations. They received columns of captives that stretched for miles, their former identities already being erased through a systematic process of dehumanization. Military conquest, however, was only one source. Piracy flourished as a semi-legitimate business across the Mediterranean, with entire fleets dedicated to raiding coastal villages. The island of Delos became the ancient world's largest slave emporium, processing up to 10,000 human beings in a single day at its peak. The Greek geographer Strabo described Delos as a cold, efficient machine for turning free men and women into tradable property, complete with holding pens, bathing facilities for preparation, and administrative offices where humans were cataloged like imported grain or olive oil. The intake process at these markets was a deliberate psychological assault designed to break the spirit. New arrivals were stripped of everything: their clothes, their possessions, and, most importantly, their names. Individual identity was the first casualty. They were given new, degrading labels: Cyrus for someone from Syria, Gallus for a Gaul, Thrax for a Thracian. They were reduced to their origin or their perceived function. The physical examination that followed was conducted with a veterinary thoroughness that is almost impossible to comprehend. Buyers would force open a slave's mouth to check their teeth, pinch and prod their bodies to assess muscle and search for hidden injuries, and conduct invasive, intimate examinations to verify claims about age, health, or reproductive history. This public naked violation by strangers was not accidental. It was a calculated tactic to destroy self-respect and individual identity before the slave-esque to working life even began. The pricing reflected a cold economic calculus. A young, healthy adult commanded a premium, while specialists like scribes or physicians were worth even more. Children were priced for their future potential, and the elderly were heavily discounted, their value tied directly to their remaining years of labor. The auctions themselves were theatrical performances, with auctioneers acting like modern salesmen, highlighting strengths and downplaying flaws, all while the merchandise, fully aware and understanding every degrading word, stood helplessly by. Roman law treated these transactions with the same seriousness as the sale of land or livestock. Bills of sale, warranty agreements, and even insurance policies were standard. Buyers could return a slave found to have a hidden defect, demand a refund if the slave died shortly after purchase, or seek compensation if the slave failed to perform as advertised. The market was highly specialized, with dealers focusing on agricultural workers, household servants, or even entertainment slaves for the wealthy. This required deep knowledge of regional markets and customer preferences. Sophisticated financing systems, including credit and investment partnerships, made slave ownership accessible to those who couldn't afford the full price, treating human lives as just another asset class. The transportation networks were as efficient as any modern logistics company, with slaves shipped thousands of miles with guaranteed delivery schedules and quality assurances, as if they were crates of wine or bolts of cloth. The timing of major auctions was strategically planned to coincide with military victories, harvest festivals, or other events that gathered wealthy buyers with cash in hand. But the auction, for all its horror, was merely the prelude. The real suffering began the moment the gavel fell and the slave was led away to a life where their humanity would be denied and their pain would become the entertainment of their owners. For those sold to work the vast agricultural estates, the latifundia, of southern Italy, dawn brought no hope, only the grim reality of what Pliny the Elder called the green hell of Roman prosperity. Archaeological excavations at sites like the Villa of Setta Finestru reveal slave dormitories that were less like barracks and more like prison cells. Slaves slept on stone platforms, with iron rings set into the walls to secure them with chains at night, a design focused purely on preventing escape and maximizing the number of workers crammed into the smallest space. By day, they worked in chain gangs, 20 or 30 individuals linked together at the ankles, moving through the fields like a single tormented organism. Overseers on horseback drove them forward with whips and hot branded iron rods. Yet, even this brutal agricultural labor was a relative luxury compared to the fate of those sent to the mines. In the silver mines of Spain and the gold mines of Gaul, a slave's life expectancy was measured in months, not years. Pliny described operations where slaves were lowered into shafts so deep that sunlight never reached them, forced to work by the flickering light of oil lamps in temperatures that could kill a healthy man in hours. They died from lung disease, cave-ins, poisoning from toxic metals, or sheer unrelenting exhaustion. The turnover was so high that a constant, fresh supply of slaves was needed just to keep the mines operating. The methods used in the Spanish gold mines reveal a complete and utter disregard for human life. Slaves were forced to divert entire rivers through tunnels to wash gold from mountainsides, working in conditions where cave-ins were not accidents, but expected occurrences. Pliny recounts how entire hillsides would collapse, burying hundreds of workers. Their bodies were never recovered because halting operations to dig them out would have been too costly. The gold was simply too valuable. The tools provided were primitive and designed for control, not efficiency. Picks and hammers were often chained to the slaves' wrists to prevent them from being used as weapons. Even the lighting was a tool of control. Overseers could extinguish the oil lamps in an instant if they suspected any hint of rebellion, plunging the workers into absolute, terrifying darkness. For urban slaves in wealthy households, the chains were less visible but no less real. They lived under constant surveillance, their every movement watched, their conversations overheard, their personal relationships controlled by masters who viewed them as sophisticated, living appliances. A rigid artificial hierarchy was imposed to prevent unity. Personal attendants to the master ranked highest, followed by kitchen staff, then cleaners, and finally, the latrine slaves who handled human waste. This system fostered competition and betrayal, ensuring that slaves policed each other, making unified resistance nearly impossible. Their duties often involved profound, intimate humiliations that went far beyond mere labor. Slaves were forced to taste their master's food to check for poison, to serve as literal human footstools or furniture during lavish dinner parties, or to perform deeply personal services designed solely to demonstrate their absolute subjugation. The punishment systems were not random outbursts of violence, but sophisticated tools of psychological and social control. Masters employed a graduated system. A first offense might mean extra work or reduced rations. A second, public humiliation in front of the household. A third, physical punishment calibrated to cause lasting pain without causing a permanent disability that would diminish the slave's economic value. The instruments of torture were crafted with chilling precision. The flagrum, the Roman whip, was often embedded with metal studs or shards of pottery designed to tear flesh and leave permanent, scarring marks that served as a lifelong brand of their disciplinary status. Branding went beyond simple identification. The patterns could denote the nature of a slave's offense, their skill level, or even serve as a crude joke from the master. Iron collars, inscribed with messages like, "Hold me, lest I flee," or even more degrading, mocking phrases about the wearer's appearance or intelligence, turned slaves into walking billboards of their own humiliation, visible to all. For those who dared to rebel, crucifixion awaited, the ultimate agonizing death. After crushing Spartacus's revolt in 71 BC, Crassus crucified 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, a 120-mile road lined with dying men, a gruesome spectacle designed to terrorize every slave who saw it. The logistics of this mass execution, preparing thousands of crosses, calculating torture methods to prolong suffering, reveal a state apparatus fully committed to the industrial-scale punishment of its human property. The physical pain, however, was only half the story. The Romans had perfected an entire science of psychological torture, methods designed to destroy dignity that were often more devastating than any whip. A slave named Fortunatus might be forced to crawl through the busy Roman forum on his hands and knees wearing an iron collar that proclaimed him a runaway, and a wooden sign that read, "I bark like a dog for scraps, all for the amusement of laughing shoppers." This wasn't punishment for a crime, it was Tuesday afternoon entertainment. Dress codes were designed to strip away humanity. Male slaves often worked nearly naked regardless of the weather to emphasize their animal status, while female slaves wore garments that were easily removed for inspection and marked them instantly as property. Their names were replaced with labels: Cocos for a cook, Syra for a Syrian girl. Hairstyles were regulated to prevent them from mimicking free citizens. They were forced to participate in Roman religious rites that mocked their own beliefs, turning sacred traditions into instruments of psychological torment. At dinner parties, as described by writers like Petronius, slaves were forced to perform increasingly degrading skits and physical stunts as the night wore on and the guests grew drunker. turning human suffering into a sophisticated form of social bonding for the elite. They were made to assist with the most private bodily functions, not out of necessity, but to obliterate any remaining boundary between human and object. Masters even competed with each other to devise the most creative humiliations for their slaves, turning cruelty into a perverse social contest. Slaves might be forced to walk through markets wearing signs detailing their crimes, or to perform utterly pointless tasks, like moving a pile of rocks back and forth, a Sisyphean labor designed to break their spirit by emphasizing their absolute powerlessness. Educated slaves from Greece or other cultured lands were forced to speak only crude, broken Latin, a linguistic humiliation meant to strip them of their intellectual dignity. Families were deliberately torn apart. Marriages had no legal standing, and children could be sold away from their parents at any moment, severing the most fundamental human bonds to prevent the formation of loyalties that might challenge the master's absolute authority. Slaves were given as gifts, presented at parties like fine wines with their special qualities described for the amusement of guests. Their suffering was woven into the fabric of Roman social and religious life, becoming a communal activity that reinforced the social order with every act of degradation. This was not hidden cruelty, it was documented in letters and literature as a casual, everyday part of life, a natural expression of the proper order between master and property. For female slaves and young males deemed attractive, the horror took an even more intimate, soul-crushing turn. In the villas of the elite, entire wings were dedicated to what guests euphemistically called pleasure gardens. The slaves who worked there knew it as the place where human dignity went to die. Roman law, as codified in Justinian's Digest, was brutally explicit. A slave can have no legal capacity whatsoever. They exist solely for their master's use and pleasure. This was not theoretical, it was daily, sanctioned practice. Breeding programs were managed like livestock operations, with female slaves evaluated for their reproductive potential and their children cataloged as future assets. Sexual violence was not a crime, but a right of ownership. Slaves were forced to perform in degrading spectacles during dinner parties, their bodies used as props for the amusement of drunken guests. Children as young as 12 or 13 were not spared. A specialized international market existed to supply wealthy households with slaves selected for their youth and beauty, complete with training to break their spirit and ensure compliance. Medical care for these slaves was provided only to maintain their usefulness, treating injuries from abuse as one would repair a valuable piece of furniture. Resistance was met with punishments specifically designed to be more terrifying than the violation itself, ensuring that compliance became the only viable option for survival. The psychological scars were permanent, leaving survivors unable to form healthy human relationships, their minds shattered by years of systematic trauma. For those who dared to flee or rebel, the ultimate punishment awaited in the arena. This was not mere execution, it was mass entertainment, a theatrical performance of death. Condemned slaves, known as damnati ad bestias, were forced to reenact mythological scenes or historical battles before being torn apart by starved beasts, lions, leopards, and bears, for the amusement of 50,000 spectators. The staging was elaborate. Victims were dressed as gods or heroes, adding a cruel layer of irony to their suffering. The events were scheduled around religious festivals and political holidays, turning mass murder into state-sanctioned celebration. The logistics were industrial. Animals were imported, slaves were transported in bulk, and engineers designed trapdoors and machinery to maximize the spectacle. The philosopher Seneca wrote with disgust of how audiences would chat and snack, barely glancing up as human lives were extinguished as mere background entertainment. After crushing a rebellion, authorities would stage week-long festivals of death, executing thousands of captured rebels in increasingly inventive and brutal ways. Detailed records were kept, not of the victims' names or lives, but of audience reactions and the cost-effectiveness of different killing methods. Even in death, there was no dignity. Slave corpses were not buried, they were disposed of like refuse. They were dumped into mass lime pits outside the city walls, their bodies layered with quicklime and dirt, erased from history as efficiently as they had been erased from life. Roman law classified them as waste, to be collected by municipal garbage crews and discarded alongside animal carcasses. Any remaining value was extracted. Teeth were pulled for dentures, skin was flayed for leather, bones were sold to medical schools for dissection. There were no tombstones, no memorials, no records. The final cruel act of the Roman slave system was to ensure that its victims were forgotten. Walk back now through the forum where we began. See it with new eyes. Those gleaming marble temples, those majestic columns, that unimaginable wealth, all of it was built on the broken backs and silent screams of millions. Conservative estimates place the slave population at 15 million, roughly 1/3 of the empire's total inhabitants. The silver that funded Rome's legions came from Spanish mines where men died in darkness. The grain that fed its cities was grown by chained hands in the green hell of the latifundia. The luxury that defined Roman life was produced by artisans who had been stolen from their homelands. The true horror is not the individual acts of cruelty, but the fact that an entire civilization, the self-proclaimed pinnacle of human achievement, built its glory on a foundation of systematic, industrialized dehumanization. Its philosophers owned slaves. Its poets celebrated human dignity while buying and selling human beings. Its lawmakers enshrined absolute ownership into legal codes that would influence Europe for 1,000 years. The chalk mark on Vercinge's shoulder has long since faded. Her name, her story, her very existence was erased by a system designed to consume human lives and leave no trace. But the stones of Rome still stand, and they whisper her story, and the stories of millions like her. They are not monuments to glory, but tombstones for a civilization that chose cruelty over compassion and power over humanity. Their suffering demands to be remembered, not as a footnote in history, but as a warning. A warning of what humans are capable of when they are allowed to believe that some lives are worth less than others.